You've said a few times over the years, but also a few times recently, that there's a window to everything, and essentially to take advantage of the gifts that are offered during that window. And you've talked about how it's hard for children to have any appreciation for what their parents are going through until and if they themselves become parents. So I wonder, how is it possible to appreciate the gifts that are given in a particular stage? Is that possible, or is it that we don't appreciate them until they're no longer with us?
I'm no longer sick, by the way. I just have an itchy throat. Just in case you may be worried a little. You know, Cassie, because of just all the political things that are happening these days, for some strange reason, just a couple of days ago, I began thinking about Karl Marx. I'm not really quite sure why he in particular came to mind. I mean, these are things that I have thought about him all these years, but it never really occurred to me, and I never really understood the sort of difficulties he had to go through. And I don't know how much this is a response to your question. You know, you're just a kid and you want to just play around and you want to have a good time with life. And you do to some extent. But you're condemned by your temperament in the sense that you see people who are homeless and it bothers you. It doesn't bother your brother who's, walking next to you, but it bothers you. And you think back to the time where people used to work in farms they used to have breakfast there and then lunch there and take a nap there and then go back to the fields and work. And while you're working, you have dialogues, you create relationships. There are only, 500 people in your village, and everybody, has a hand in just the way society is. And everybody knows everybody. It's an amazing phenomenon. And you get maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 advertisements through the whole of your life. You marry the people your parents want you to marry. You have the profession that you basically take over your father's business, or you follow in his footsteps. And then you begin to see these huge factories coming in. People's livelihoods are destroyed. You have this huge plot of land, but what's the use of growing anything in them anymore? It's going to take you like 6 months to grow anything, and the factory can make it in 2 weeks. So you go bankrupt. There is no money coming in, there is no job. You get sad, you get depressed. And out of desperation, you move to big cities. City like Oakland. Everything about Oakland is different. You walk away from your parents, from your tradition, from your culture, in hopes of making a few dollars. But in your village, someone tells you the story of Jonah and you feel loneliness. You don't have to be told the story of Jonah in the city. The city just makes you feel alone and desperate. And the commoners don't make factories, Cassie. It's the rich people who make factories. And it's the rich people who employ poor people like me for pennies. That's what my life is worth, pennies. And when goods are produced, they're advertised to me. And I want the things that's advertised to me. And they keep pushing this want until it becomes a need. And then I become addicted. And I'm more than willing to spend the rest of my life working at this factory, making pennies, saving my pennies to buy a toaster. Then from a toaster it becomes, a coffee maker, then from a coffee maker to a fridge, then to a dishwasher, then to a car. And then I'm just held hostage. And that's what Mark saw. He's thrown out of Germany, he's thrown out of France, he's thrown out of Belgium. He creates unions, but they never blossom into anything substantial. And when his kid dies, he says it was a sacrifice that I made to the rich. They killed her. And then his wife gets cancer. And then his daughter dies. And then 2 months later he dies. You know, I look at my life from the morning I wake up to the time I go to bed. I am working for some factory I don't even see. But the factory is so clever, it's so cunning, that it gives me the illusion that I have free will, I have creativity, I have autonomy, that my life belongs to me, that these are my dreams and these are my goals and these are my hopes. And all of a sudden a window opens. You know, one of the nice things about this ritual we call Passover, you have the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh is big, the Pharaoh is powerful. He owns the world. You know, it's a man who is filled with greed, and he has the power to just get whatever he wants. You can consider the Pharaoh to be like a factory. And the factory just needs one thing, really: people who don't think. The Pharaoh says it's Passover, so it's Passover. People celebrate it. It's Christmas. It's Ramadan. There is no thinking involved. It's just a ritual that people do in sleep. Then you have someone who has become innocent, an unspotted lamb, if you will, like a Moses, you know, who was no different from Pharaoh in the beginning. But he begins to question. He refuses to die. On the inside, the very factories and pharaohs push us into death, you know. And as he walks into the desert, you know, little by little, he sheds his skin. All the qualities that lived inside him to be a pharaoh, to want to be a pharaoh, to act like a pharaoh, they all just like fall into the desert and just wither. And he comes back. And anyone who lives outside of Pharaoh's vision, not Pharaoh's, but Moses' vision, they just die. You know, you put some blood around the door and death can never enter. And that's the window, Cassie. You know, Gurdjieff was right in so many ways. You know, that life is so powerful. It just, you think you're awake and you think you're creative, but you really aren't. Once in a while, you know, a window opens and some air comes in, and you wake up and you see. And you want to fight against conformity, all the things that make you comfortable. But it's so difficult to keep this window open because it creates so many uncertainties, you know. I mean, it's great to be a pharaoh. It's great to want to be a pharaoh. All the signposts are there. You can read them, follow them. But to walk into the desert, and there is no end in sight. I think every person has a window that opens once in a while. Keeping that window open is difficult, Cassie. The air that comes in to the old life, it goes against everything. And in as much as you want to keep the window open, you always go back to the bad old habits. It's easier. But I don't think that's your question. Your question is about seasons. I don't think you can appreciate anything unless you're in it yourself. It's impossible. You know, a few nights ago, Sarah and the kids were out and they spent the night at a place where the kids were having, swimming and all that. And she went to the campus the following morning, so I was home by myself. And I think I don't know, I had a stomach flu or something. And from 11 at night until about 6 in the morning, I just couldn't move. I had so much pain. I stood, there was pain. I laid down, there was pain. I laid on my sides, there was pain. And it was a window, despite all the pain that I was going through, it was a window where it made me think about Sarah's father who had cancer. And he was in so much pain. Stage 4, that's a tough place to be. It made me think of Ali Husseinian, who would always tell me, Amir, I'm not afraid of death. What I'm afraid of is a death that comes with a lot of pain. It's good to just put your head down and never wake up. But to wake up with pain, and to live with pain, and to go to sleep with pain. And throughout the next couple of days, the only thing that I was thinking about is the window or the opportunity that allowed me to kind of go beyond my own pain and just to some extent understand how much you're dependent on your physical body, how much you need other people in times of crisis, how much and how foolish it is for anyone to have a support system and yet turn their back on that support system, imagining themselves to be proficient enough, sufficient enough to take care of their issues. And while you're in pain, you say, once I get healthy, I will eat better, I will think better, I will do better. But you know what the problem is, Cassie? The pain went away. But I have to manipulate myself. I have to constantly think about pain. And it's such a tough job because the kids come and distract you. The family life distracts you. The essays you have to read distract you. Your own passions and desires and ridiculous infantile dreams distract you. And you really have to work so hard to keep that window open, because through that window you get to understand pain a little, you get to understand forgetfulness a little. And you grow to have a lot of respect for anyone who suffers. And you don't do it because you want to be compassionate. It's not about that. It's not about you're going out there and becoming a hippie and helping everyone out there. It's just, accessing this part of you that allows you to see what happens to a human being who goes through a lot of pain. It doesn't mean you want to help them, you just want to understand. Sometimes my parents call and I'm tired. I'm sitting in this room and I look at my phone. It's a call from my parents, and I don't want to pick up. The room is dark, I'm by myself, it's quiet, it's nice. And all of a sudden a thought occurs to me that, your dad is 92. He could put his head down and never wake up. Do you really want to miss the opportunity? But because I'm in the habit of thinking like that, I answer their call, or if they disconnect, I call them after 5 minutes. We have a chit chat, and that's it. At least I've spoken to them, perhaps for the last time. If you're not in the habit, there's a good chance that there is this window is going to open, and then it's going to shut very, very, very quickly. And earlier I brought up Karl Marx because he really did so much. The very fact that you only work 8 hours a day, that's because of him. The fact that we have unions, that's because of him. And the more I think about all the things that he did and all the difficulties he went through, it stops me from buying anything to help the rich get richer and to help the rich exploit the poor even more. I don't know how long this window is going to remain open. Maybe I'll walk into a classroom on Monday and my old, stupid, arrogant self will come to the top. We'll talk for a few minutes, feel good about all the things I say. Then I will casually walk to my office. There is when Rumi met Shams, the window automatically opened. And Rumi, I'm sure he was immersed, he was joyous to sit, behind closed doors and have a chat with this man for hours. And then this man leaves. And in Laos, he begins to appreciate. In Laos, he begins to have this really innocent and intense longing. And then he does what he can to send his people around the world to look for this man. And he's eventually found, he's brought back. Depression goes away, sadness goes away, joy comes forth. And he doesn't want the window to be shut. And so what he does, he says, here, why don't you marry my daughter? Even though she's like 40 years younger than you, or marry her nevertheless. But Rumi again falls into forgetfulness in the sense that he allows his students to badmouth Shams, to disrespect him. And even though Shams tells Bahauddin, Rumi's son, that listen, if this continues, I will leave. And his son tells Rumi that this is what Shams told me, you got to do something. And Rumi imagines that this window is not going to shut, it's impossible, Shams is not going to go away. But he did. And you would think that by the time Rumi gets done writing the Kulliyat, all the poems in honor of his teacher Shams, that he has the autonomy and the creativity and the independence and the sufficiency to just continue writing. But no, the window shuts, Cassie. he shuts to the point where the window shuts to the point where he can't write anymore, when he falls into depression. We have this idea that, spiritual people, if you want to categorize them as such, that at will they can do, all sorts of things. At least the life of Shams, says that's not the case. Once you lose the very component that brings you to life, opens this window, the sun comes through, and the wind comes through, and life enters. You have no idea how long that life is going to last, and I think we're all that way. We're all like the prodigal son when the window opens and life enters. And it doesn't mean that you spend your riches on crummy things, but you just swim in the joy and in the happiness and the pleasure, and there is nothing wrong with it. And it creates this illusion that it's always going to be there. And even if it goes away, we can play with the memories, And we can somehow create a duplicate. It doesn't happen for Rumi. For 2 years, he just sits in depression. He says, I just want to see something in someone that can remind me of something, that the window can open, I can see life, I can see happiness, I can see joy. I think while you have your riches, it's very difficult to be gracious, to be thankful. I really think the tragedy for us, Cassie, is it's in loss. Gurdjieff, he would invite all sorts of people to his gatherings until he had the car accident where he almost died. He lost a lot of blood. He was a complete mess. He did something amazing despite all of his talk about awareness and not falling asleep and once he regained his health, he sits and he says, about 2/3 of the people who are here, they're a complete waste. I don't want them around. And so he gets rid of a lot of people. And he makes the environment very, very difficult for people. It's because all of a sudden, despite all the things he had said about time, about life, about death, he comes to realize that he is going to die. And why would he want to spend his time with people when he can sit and write? Because his writing can become immortal. People are not going to hold him immortal in their psyche or in their heart. That's not the way people function. And so he really became so mean that he became indigestible for a lot of people there, and they eventually left. You read in the New Testament, like the bride and groom story, where I think, if I'm not mistaken, the groom is fasting, or maybe the bride is fasting. And someone says, well, why don't you break your fast, start eating? He says, no, I can't do that. He says, this is so ridiculous, You've been waiting for the bride to come. The bride has been here. And he was talking really about himself. that you keep waiting and waiting and waiting. Just open your eyes, I'm right in front of you, you know. I think in many ways we are blind, and I think in loss, something happens to us. You know, Helen has been dead for almost a year or so. You know, I still think about the pavilion. It is such a special space. You know, it's very difficult to kind of encounter spaces like that, Cassie. While Helen was there, of course, all of us appreciated Helen, her home, and the space in which we gathered. And even though there came a point where Helen no longer wanted a gathering there, we no longer really wanted to go there, we just disappeared. It's been many years since we've been to that place, but I miss it. The trees, you know, the animals, just the pond, the energy that that space, you know, had. And sometimes you sit back and you say, well, if you knew all of this stuff, how come you didn't push Helen? You know, maybe you could have given her more money. Maybe you could have even offered to buy the place. Because there is something about us that is wasteful and forgets and falls asleep. Part of it is because our organism, you know, puts us to sleep. The other is just the everyday stuff that we gotta do. The other is our own ridiculous ambitions and passions and wounds and scars. And you have to go against so many forces to keep any window open, you know. Something as basic as your health, you know. You know, the last time we had a gathering at Hussein's as a student teacher was, I don't even know, maybe 25, 30 years ago, 35 years ago. While I was there, the assumption that I had was Hussein is always going to be there. These gatherings are always going to be there. I'm never going to grow tired. And lo and behold, I grew tired. Not tired, I just lost the interest. I could now read and understand. I could now work with other teachers, you know. But I never really were in the right place to quite understand the value of Hussein. I was 20, I'm now 60. I am dimly beginning to understand, Cassie. You know, that I should have been much more grateful. But we're all working with limited perspectives, limited information, limited insights. And because we're limited in so many different ways, there is a part of you that is thankful, but there are so many parts of you that is just not so gracious, you know. Can you maybe repeat your question again? because I think I'm like going to places I shouldn't be going. No, but I like to hear it again.
Well, it was about what you'd said about certain windows or stages, I guess, only being open for a limited time. And that, yeah.
You know, I have some students, Cassie, you know, while we're in the class, and you know, the class conversation is sometimes intense and it captures people, and one raises his or her hand and says, well, can I come and visit you? I say, sure. But they are caught by inspiration, you see. They don't really understand what it is, and they don't really understand how they need to protect it. It's like money. It just comes from nowhere, you know. It's like you find the 20 in your pocket and say, oh, okay, and you just waste it, you know, most often. And so, you know, they say, yeah, I'll come tomorrow. I say, okay, fine. And tomorrow, of course, for them never comes because, you know, life gets in, and fear gets in, and anxiety gets in, and all sorts of, you know, ridiculous things. You know, Cassie, when you're 20 and you go out with someone who is young and immature and stupid, you really do have the stamina to forgive them and to overlook their wrongs. And you do that for like, I don't know, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. You get 30 and you're a bit more exhausted. Because, you know, you're carrying a lot of things now, in addition to the relationship. Then you get together with another person. Of course, there is something wrong with you because you keep going out with the same people, you know, same qualities. But this time, even though you're going out with a person with the same tendencies, you realize that you're not as patient. That window where you could forgive someone for 10 years straight has now been reduced to maybe just 2 years. You know, and during those 2 years, you scream more, you're impatient more. And then eventually there comes a point where you say, I just don't want this anymore, and dump him. Then you get to be 40. You know too much and you see too much. And because you know too much and you see too much, those two components take away whatever patience that you used to have. So you go out someone and you realize that this is like the third bottle of beer and it's your first date. You kind of just come up with an excuse and you leave, you know. And from that point on, it becomes very, very difficult for you to find a companion because you don't have the patience for nonsense anymore, you know. You know, when my parents came here, they said to me, Amir, go to school. I said, oh, Dad, I hate school. Amir, get married. Oh, Dad, I'm doing all this stuff. I don't want to get married. And he would always tell me, Amir, you know, there is a season for everything. You know, if you want to stay in school, if you want to continue with your education, you need a mind that's fresh, that has the capacity to sit, to listen, to observe, to sit somewhere and do homework for 5, 10 hours. You can't do that at the age of 40. You need to do it from the age 18 to about maybe 25, 26. But, you know, you're young and you're just stupid because you lack the experience and the insight and the foresight. And then you get to be 25, 26. Amir, you should get married. Dad, marriage? No, I'm a philosopher. I don't get married. This is too early for me. I want to figure out myself. You know. Amir, you get married. You know, if you get older, it'll be more difficult. But the wisdom of your parents, you don't really have, because the wisdom of your parents, it's rooted in understanding, in experience, in their own tragedies, which I didn't go through. So whenever someone gives you a piece of wisdom or insight or opens a window, for you it's like a bumper sticker because it's not your experience. And you can't value something that's not yours. You know. And so they say, Amir, you know, you can't have kids at the age of 40. Kids need park. Kids need running around. Kids need energy. Kids need wrestling. You know, you need to like box them, wrestle them. And you can't do that when you're 95, you know. And at every corner he would tell me, you know, there is a window to everything. Once that window shuts, it doesn't mean you can't do them. It'll just be more difficult to do them. You know, it's kind of like what in The Strange Life of Ivan Osokin, where the magician looks at Osokin and says, you know, why don't you go away and think about this? I'll give you like 5 hours. He says, well, what if I want like 2 weeks? Well, I won't be here. I can only give you 5 hours. Well, does that mean that if you're not here, I will never find you? He says, no, you can find me, but I may no longer be interested. Or you may not find me. You may have the interest, but that interest may never be satisfied. You know. I don't know if you have seen these like blind voice auditions. You know, what you have is this like 18-year-old kid, and he has a really, really good voice, but he's addicted to a certain way of singing. And as these coaches, you know, they have their backs to this kid, and this kid is singing, and all of them push this button, and they turn around, they say, wow, this kid has a nice voice. And eventually one person chooses to coach this young kid. And it's a window. It's a window towards singing songs you're not comfortable with, expanding your range. And if you're able to listen to this coach, if you're able to kind of allow this window to remain open, you will have fame, you will have money, you can eventually have enough power to sing the sort of songs you want to sing, you know. But it's difficult to appreciate unless you have an army behind you, keep telling you how poor you are and how the presence of this particular person can enrich your life, you know. I think if we had the capacity to appreciate windows, Cassie, opportunities given to us by life, there would be no need for alarm clocks, you know, where you have to like spank yourself intellectually or emotionally to remain awake, to pay attention, to observe, to appreciate. None of those things are needed. But that's not the way we operate. You know, when I went to Sarah's class the other day, I had told her, you know, for like 2, 3 days, I don't want to come to your school. I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't have much to say. And she kept pushing and pushing and pushing until I said, okay, but you know, it's going to be a waste of time. See, there was a stage in my life where I would enjoy seeing students inspired. I didn't care if they stuck around afterwards, you know, just for them to come to life for 5, 10 minutes, that would be sufficient for me. And I told Sarah, Sarah, I'm not interested. I'm not interested in coming to your school, you know, seeing people for an hour, you know, getting them excited or inspired, and then driving home. You know, that stage for me is gone. I am interested in a relationship. Because in a relationship, what happens is the window remains open. I will do what I can to keep the window open, unless, you know, I try to keep the window open and the student says, I really don't enjoy this window being open, I want to shut it. And you can't do anything without another's permission, you know. And when I walked into her class, I was serious, I was unfun, I was uninviting, I was not hospitable. And people can sense that, you know. But if you were to look at me some 5 years ago or 10 years ago, it'd be very, very different, because my expectation was different from myself and from other people. You know, and it's not that getting people excited or inspired, you know, it has zero value. It's quite nice, but it no longer gives me the pleasure that it used to. So that window is gone for me. And in many ways, it's a tragedy, it's a loss, you know. Because you can't just walk in the classroom, look at someone, and after 10 minutes say, are we going to have a relationship, or is this just a hit and run, you know? Well, because, you know, give them some tea, give them some food, let them come by like 10, 15, 20 times, you know, and then maybe they'll bite. But you get to a place where you just say, I don't really care. They want to come, come. They don't want to come, so what? Doesn't matter, you know. Sa'di has a poem, از دست زبان که براید که از نعمت شکرت به سر آید. Who can, with their tongue or their thought, always be thankful for all the gifts, all these windows that are open unto them? We are far too insufficient, Cassie. Why go so far away, Cassie? I remember you many, many, many years ago. You know, while walking at Sierra, you would say, oh, Amir, I feel so much. I'm breaking into like 1,001 pieces. And I would always look and say, Cassie, Cassie, Cassie. One of these days you're going to come to me and say, oh, Amir, I can't feel anything. you know. And that's exactly how it happened. It happens to all of us. You feel and you can't fit your own skin. Your body is far too small for all the emotions that you feel, and they're so intense, so explosive. But you can't see them as gifts because they're filled with pain and longing and yearning and sorrow. There is so much inspiration, excitement, and creativity. You have no idea where to pour the stuff in. There is no container for it. You know, so you say death is much better than being alive. Then time passes. You begin to understand. You know that saying by Kierkegaard, you know, don't tell me what to think. You know, give me an idea that I can feel so I can sacrifice my entire life for it. I mean, I'm looking for that window where something can enter. It can be full of life. And I can say all else that lives in life is without much value. I want that, only that. You know, I don't know if the story that Sadhguru, this Indian teacher, says is true or not. Supposedly he worked for the government, and one day on his motorcycle he just went to have some lunch somewhere, and he just feels a little funny. He feels as if he's cheating himself out of life. And he has like an expansive experience, you know, and he's married and he has a kid. He just refuses to go back to work, and refuses to go back to the marriage, and refuses to be a father. You know, if you wake up tomorrow and you happen to be in a reflective mood, it only takes Layla's scream, "Mom, where is breakfast?" for that mood to go away. And you realize instead of you desiring to sit and read a book, you're there making breakfast. You know, if you have the right kind of inspiration, if that window ever opens, try to protect it.
Which window?
Whatever window, Baba, that says to you, you know, go play soccer, you know, go run around the block. Because if you forget that, you'll be sitting on the sofa watching Bluey, and then you realize you can no longer walk. You no longer enjoy going outside. You will no longer have any friends. You will lose the ability. And you'll just live a lonely, miserable life. Sometimes there is no window in this house, Cassie, so I come to this back room and say, maybe I can sit. Nothing. Maybe I can like find the book. No. Then I go to the other, book room. Maybe I can find a book here that I can open a window to get some life into me. Nothing. And I said, maybe I should go to the shed downstairs and look at some books down there and enjoy the space there. Nothing. There are no windows. And if I find any windows, none open. When you're young, it's very different. And when you lack experience, because you're open to all sorts of possibilities. When you get a little older, when you know a bit more, it's really, really difficult. It reminds me of that story about this Sufi who was in the bathroom, and he yells to his disciple, come grab my cloak and give it to so-and-so. And the student says, but you're in the bathroom. I'll wait till you finish and then I will come and grab your jacket. He says, no, that may be too late. Too late, why? He says, right now the mood has inspired me to give away my khair so you can give it to my friend. My mood may be stolen by life the next moment. So just come and grab it as quickly as you can. Many years ago, one of our friends called and said, my friend from Germany is here. He knows the poetry of Hafiz and his life inside and out. Come. This is like years after Hussein. So I get in the car and I drive really fast to this guy's house.
So I wasn't alive? Was I alive?
No, Baba.
How many years before?
Oh, this was like 40 years ago, Baba. You were still walking with the angels.
So you were 20.
That's right, Baba. He knows his math. And I go there, I was so excited to go there and just take what this guy had to offer. And he opens his mouth.
Take in a good or a bad way?
Bad way, Baba. He opens his mouth and he says, well, Hafiz enjoyed drinking very much. I said, what the heck? And the window quickly shut. Sometimes you can have the wrong people in your life. One of the things about people who are like depressed, not in a healthy way, is that when you look at their contact lists, all the people they talk to have the same sort of narratives that they themselves do. And whenever they're inspired to talk to someone, they kind of pick up their cell phone and talk to the people with the same old stories that reinforce whatever trauma or negative experience that they, experienced many years ago. I was going to school a couple years ago, around 4 in the morning, and NPR had this radio show. It was about this a young man who would pick up his father early morning and they would head to work together. And he said, every morning my father would tell me the same story over again and over and over and over again, like, you know. And I was filled, he would say, with so much frustration because I would want to tell him, Dad, you told me the story yesterday and the day before yesterday. Can you come up with something different? And then he says, one day I go to pick him up and my mom tells me he passed away in his sleep, you know. And of course there is the grieving period, and then he says, after a week, I was driving to work. And all of a sudden I realized how much I miss, you know, hearing the same old stories of my father, but my father is no longer around. So, it's a tragedy, Cassie, in many ways. That we understand so many things after we no longer have them. You know. Once in a while you have an inkling of understanding where you pick up the phone and you call your parents and you say thank you. But that's just once in a while. You know. The rest of the time, just you're in the grips of life. You stand no chance. Excuse me. Alam niyo po. Yeah.
I'm tired.
You're tired?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it almost time for you to go to bed?
No.
Yeah.
Stacy, anything?
At first I was wondering if you could talk about the value of shame and its opposite. And then it's like a mood changes and there's a different question. Could you talk about the value of love? So just if either of those is more interesting to you.
Shame is really, really good. It's enormously valuable. It's something you should be very proud of, that you still have parts of you that feels ashamed because you haven't lived up to a certain image. You know, I used to play tennis with the tennis ball in Davis, and the tennis ball would always return the ball back to you, you know, and it would create for you this illusion that you were such a good player. And then all of a sudden from nowhere a stranger would come to you and say, would you like to go to the court, and play? Say sure. And you walk in with so much pride. But when you play with a living human being, you have no idea where they're going to hit the ball. You know, and you have fear, you have anxiety, you have frustration, and then you lose the game, and then you lose the match. And your body language is filled with shame, that I thought I was this, but I'm really down here. I thought I can enter a tournament and play the A category, but I'm really like in the D category. I really like stink as a tennis player. Someone who has no shame respects nothing, values nothing, can't repent, doesn't have any remorse, can't feel guilty, because that person doesn't hold anything or anyone above themselves. For them, everything is a green light. Everything is, there are no lines that can't be crossed. They feel entitled. You know, like when you hear some politicians, for example, like coming on TV and saying all sorts of things, and you say, I don't mind if a 20-year-old was to say these things on, TV, but for a 50-year-old or a 60-year-old or an 80-year-old, have they no shame? I was with Hussein. And when you're working with religious and philosophical ideas, whether you want to or not, they force you to have a certain self-image, that you see yourself as somewhat aware and mindful. You need to speak a certain way. You need to be around a specific group of people. Your conversations have to be, mostly revolving around philosophy and religion. And so I remember there was this young woman, and she lived with her parents not too far from the car wash. And every time she would come by, she would say, "We should have dinner sometimes." I always resisted, except this one time because she was with her mom, and I kind of felt embarrassed not to say yes. And so we went out to this Chinese restaurant called Chopsticks. It was on Sunrise and, I don't know, somewhere. And we were just sitting in the car. She didn't know much about me. But she said that for someone who works at the car wash, you speak good English. It's like educated English. I said, "Oh, okay, thank you." She asked me, "Well, have you ever gone to school?" I said, "Yeah, I have a couple of degrees." And then, you're young and she's young and she's attractive. And things begin to happen, not too much, just very much on the surface. And then all of a sudden something about me catches myself. That, "Amir, for the past 3, 4, 5 years you've been this way. And all of a sudden you're becoming this way. And this is a self that you had crushed and you never allowed it to come to the surface, And then you feel bad and you feel ashamed because you feel as if all of your work has all of a sudden gone into a trash bin. One single action has made everything else you've done for the past 5 years without any value. And you kind of look at her and, you nicely say to her, "I'm sorry, I really got to go home. My parents are waiting." And I remember we didn't have cell phones then, so I stopped by a payphone and I called Hussein and I said, "I need to come to your house." Because that image that I had of myself was Hussein's creation. It was Hussein's hard work. It was Hussein's time. I didn't see it that way then, but I see it now. That everything that made me that way was because of his effort, Now, he may have done all of this for self-serving reasons, but it also served me by default. And so I went to him around 1 or 2 in the morning, and I just broke down. And I was not just embarrassed. Embarrassment is something that it's like a slip, Shame is something very, very, very different. That there is someone you trust, there is someone you love, there is someone you respect, there is someone you fear. And you betrayed all those things. And you knew you were betraying them, but you betrayed them nevertheless. And I wanted to be forgiven, and I thought that if I was to break down, and it wasn't like I thought thought about this before going, and it just happened, they just broke down. And then he says, "What happened?" I said, "This happened." He said, "That's it?" I said, "Yeah, that's it." But because he had already traveled all these paths, for him, what he considered to be such a minor transgression, for me was like a huge deal, because I was a novice, I was a beginner, and this was new to me. But Hussein had forgotten all of this stuff, but for him it no longer really was relevant. They were no longer that important. So he kind of taps me on the head and he says, okay, go wash your face, I'll make some tea, and then you can go home. Ever since I had my triple bypass, every time I have a sweet tooth, so every time I have something that I shouldn't have, and I don't have very much of it anymore, but I kind of stand before a mirror for like a second and I look at my body and I say, I really apologize, but I just had to take this like ice cream, a little bit, or a tiramisu, or a chocolate cake, or whatever. Because you feel responsible towards something or towards someone, and you feel like you're not living up to that responsibility, you know, and it's valuable for you to live up to that responsibility, but for some strange reason you're just deficient. And your head kind of lowers, you know, you bow, and shame comes in. I think the trick in shame is that it is good to be shameful around the right people and the right environment, you know, towards the right things. You know, it's like if you want to read a chapter from the Quran, wash your hands, because your hands have been to all over the place, metaphorically as well as literally. You know, not only must you wash your physical hands with soap and water because you've lived in the world and you're approaching something that's profoundly sacred. So have some self-respect, have some shame. Also, you know, you have intellectual hands by which you kind of assume, you project, you assume that you understand what you're reading, you know, so you approach everything with a good amount of modesty. So, you know, one of the nice things about kids is that they're at a certain age where they like words that for the ears of adults, they sound really, 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 really bad. I mean, they're just bad words to use. Okay, I would never use them, but kids do. They do because they have no knowledge of what these words mean and the context in which these words should be used. And because of their innocence, that shame doesn't exist. And because that shame doesn't exist, there are no lines that they think they're crossing. So for them, anything is okay. And once they use such a word, they laugh and they giggle and they keep repeating it over and over and over and over again. And as a father, as a mother, as some sort of an adult, you sit back and you say, wow, why are they repeating this particular word? It means such an awful thing. And one would hope that once you age a little bit and once you gain some maturity, society has socialized you in a relatively healthy way. Your parents have in a healthy way. Your friends have in a healthy way. The books you have read, the schools, the classes you have taken, you know, that all these different forces have given you a certain framework where just in case you cross certain lines, shame will come to you. With shame comes guilt, it comes remorse, then comes repentance. And in repentance, you are baptized, you know. And in your baptism, you're born again. And you hope that you don't repeat the same mistakes, but that usually doesn't happen. We keep repeating until, you know, If not that mistake, other mistakes. And I think so, someone who doesn't have any shame about them, you know. You know, sometimes we invite people to the house, okay? And this is, I don't know if this is like something universal, if it's just, you know, people just don't think or care. If you invite me to your house, I feel obligated, like in the morning or a day or two later, to send you a thank you text. You know, thank you for hosting us. I know it was tough. You know, thank you for being gracious, so hospitable. The food was delicious, even though, you know, it tasted like poison. Just in case I don't send you a thank you note, and I have no shame about not sending you a thank you note, you could either say to yourself, well, he's not socialized well, his parents didn't train him the right way. Maybe he knows that he should send a thank you note, but he's far too stupid, careless, indifferent. Okay? Now, you'd be very, very generous to categorize me as someone who's not been socialized well, you know, and then forgive my transgression by simply saying, it's not in his culture. I will train him, okay? What I will do, I will go to his house without a phone call, prior notice, and I will ask him to make me some food. And then I will explain to him how difficult it is for him to have come from work, the house is a mess, he's exhausted, yet he's forced to cook me food, and he's forced to being a good host. And then I will tell him thank you, in hopes that he will get it. You know. Now again, you could chalk it off to this guy has not been socially trained. The other thing that will happen, going back to Cassie's question, is, you know, I don't have the patience for that. It's such a basic thing. You know, someone spends money, spends time, spends energy, doing all the stuff. The least you can do is just say a thank you. Have you no shame? Now, if you realize you're at a certain stage in your life where you can't tolerate someone's shamelessness, you just cut them off. You've opened a few windows for them. They saw the window being open. You took advantage of some openings, but you weren't responsible towards it. You didn't do the right things, you know, and you had no shame in not doing the right thing. You just looked the other way. So shame is really, really, really good, you know. It keeps society intact. It keeps relationships intact. It allows you to have a good amount of self-respect. But the moment you lose that, you know, you know, one of the problems with anger is that it's like 5,000 years of cultural narratives that domesticates you in not crossing certain lines with your companion. It all disappears. In anger, it's like the flood happens, everything dies, and you become very raw, you know, you become like a Stone Age Homo sapien. And you say to your friend, to your parents, to your companion, whatever you want to say. My brother had a colleague in school. He said to him that one day my father made me very angry, and I went to him and I punched him in the face. And he said this happened in my 20s. He was now 58. He said, I have never forgiven myself for that. That it's a wonderful thing for someone to have committed a transgression and then shame was imposed on this person, and that shame created a good amount of guilt, and he spent the rest of his life trying to make up for that one tiny episode. Now imagine if he had no shame in him. It would have probably broken his father even more, you know. The idea that I walk into my classroom and I ask my students, how many of you smoke? And hands go up. There is no shame. There is no self-respect. How many of you watch like images on your laptop that you shouldn't be watching perhaps? And even if you're watching, why would you raise your hand? Why do you think it's something that you should not be ashamed of? You know, or students using profanities in the classroom. I mean, you have to be profoundly depraved and deprived of so many customs to give yourself the right to raise your hand expressing some very unsavory things about yourself in public, you know. Or, I don't know if you've seen how sometimes politicians talk, you know, that some guy has invited some people and this committee is supposed to figure out some things. So this like 70-some-year-old man looks at this like 30-some-year-old woman and says to her, are you like a terrorist? You know, I mean, that's the first question. Doesn't know much about her. And you sit back and you say, what the hell is this? You know, I mean, forget that you're a senator. More importantly, you're like a 70-some-year-old man. Have you no shame? You know, have you no self-respect? You know. And so, you know, when you have a culture in which it considers nothing shameful, or when you have a person that considers nothing shameful, then, you know, either the culture or the person, they're just both going down, you know. I mean, it's something that all of us in this room experience because we are all teachers, that you walk into the classroom and you say, today I'm going to inspire my students. Today I'm going to like have this beautiful relationship with ideas, and I'm going to express these ideas in a way that will excite my students. And then you go in there and you open your mouth and it's dead. And you kind of just put your head down and you walk to your office in such a gloomy way. And it's not an embarrassing moment for you. You're just ashamed that I, as a 60-some-year-old man, with all these years of experience, all this ridiculous information in my head, did not have the ability to express these ideas in a way that could excite me or other people, you know. And then you say, well, what kind of an educator are you? You read all these books. What the hell happened to your understanding? You know. And then you watch your students kind of like, one is yawning, the other is like asleep, the other is like packing his stuff. He was ready to leave. And you say, man, you know, I am the cause of their boredom. And, you know, if there is shame inside you, you kind of just say, you know what, I'm not worthy to have this office, I'm not worthy to have this job. You just go around the estuary, you beat yourself up intellectually and emotionally. And you say, you know what, like Rabi'ah, you know, Rabi'ah, the Sufi woman around the 8th century, who says to God, you know, I want to pray, and I want to cry when I pray, and I want to feel when I pray. But as I'm standing to pray, I can't feel anything. And says to God, either accept a prayer that has no life in it, or give me a heart that's full of life, and full of repentance, and full of remorse, and so full of passion and love, that can inspire a prayer that you can accept, you know. You know, it's good for you to want to be a Malcolm X. and then have shame whenever you shortchange yourself. You know, it's good to watch English Patient and say, I want to be in love. And I want to go home and look at my companion with love. And when you realize you can't do that, there is an element of shame inside you. You know, and these are wonderful things. You know, it's great that Adam and Eve realized that they had done something that disappointed God. They loved God. They didn't want to see someone that they love be hurt, but they did hurt God. And they were ashamed. Shame is good. It says that you're still human. You can still feel. You can still look at someone with a good amount of respect. You know, when you lose that, it's something that happens to all of us, you know. You're young. You get a little older. You lose time. You lose vitality. You stand before a mirror. And you say, I haven't done anything with my life. What a shame. You know. Sometimes when there is shame and when there is repentance, you know how to make it up. You know, like you drive all the way here from Sacramento. It's a 2-hour drive, 2-hour back. That's 4 hours of your day. And you come here, and I'm not a generous host, and I'm mean, and I don't have patience. I have to look at you, and I have to look at your time, and I have to look at your age, and I have to look at the travel time, and the passion with which you got yourself in the car and drove here. And I have to be ashamed for treating you this way. And then now you go home, you're saying to yourself, really? Did I drive 4 hours back and forth, you know, to be treated in such an awful way? You know, if I had any sense of decency, I would be ashamed for being the way that I was. And that would inspire me to give you a call and say, Stacy, I'm really, 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 really sorry. Please forgive me. Sometimes you commit certain acts and you are shameful of those acts, like wasting time. But there isn't much you can do to recover from that. The shame doesn't go away. The waste doesn't go away. There is nothing you can do to recover from it. You know, this window, youth, whatever you want to do, you have to do it before your body falls ill. Because once it does, you can't do much. I mean, once you have a migraine headache, once you're diagnosed with cancer, once you're limping along because you have arthritis, it's going to be impossible for you to sit and read a book. You know, and you say, man, you know, all those years where I just gave my time away to ridiculous people, I could have sat, I could have read, I could have written, I could have thought, you know, and then comes an element of shame, but there is no recovery from that. All you have is just regret. And you just have to wait and wait and wait until you get to a place of acceptance. And you say, you know what? I did the best I could. That's all I can do. And that kind of acceptance at that stage, it'll just remove shame from the picture itself. You know. But all in all, shame is good. Modesty is good. It's good to be those things. You know. It's good for me to walk into the classroom and talk about Plato's allegory of the cave in a scholarly way, because I forget that this is philosophy, love of wisdom, and that's what the allegory is. But they just go in there and treat it like a mathematical equation. And it's good for me to walk away from the class having a window open inside my psyche saying, Amir, this was Plato, who lived with his teacher, who saw his teacher died, and out of depression and desperation, all he did was to write. You know, it's not just ink on paper, it's Plato's blood, Plato's passion, Plato's love affair. How dare you just go to class and just make everything into a game? Have you no shame? That's good. You know, it brings about humility. It's a good baptism to have. You know, it's kind of like your line of work. You know, you take care of the dying, you know, and every time you're around someone who's in pain and who's dying and you see family members just waiting, you know, you think about your time, you think about your past, you think about your age, and these are like tormenting places to be. You know, you can't get your youth back, you can't get your time back, and you're just left in this desert of regret. So shame is good. It's really good. شب بخیر بابا جون. مرسی صوفیه بابا. بابا مرسی بابا. میخواستم بگم در رو میبندی بابا. Beginning, anything?
I'm not sure really. I guess it feels that if I'm feeling and sometimes your thoughts, there's a gap. I think thinking and reflection seems not sufficient if it doesn't have proper experience go with it. I don't know, I just feel there's a gap in for everything to come together.
So the idea whatever the idea may be. I'm going to create a story and you tell me if I'm on the right track. Let's say you sit in my class and you're a 20-year-old young woman and you took a philosophy class because you heard from someone that philosophy is a very exciting subject. And you sit in my class and you realize that my class bores you. And you want to end your life in my class because it's so bad. And so you take out your notebook and you say, well, I want to be a teacher. And if I was Amir Sabzavari, I would do all these things differently. I would do it this way, and then this way, and then this way, and then this way. And so you write a book about how to be a really, really good teacher. Even though you've never taught, okay? And so you transfer to a 4-year school, you get your bachelor's, and as you go to school, you're exposed to more ideas. And so your list of how to be a good teacher grows even bigger. And then you get to the master's program and the list gets even bigger. And then as part of your PhD agreement, they say, okay, you're going to take 2 classes and you're going to teach 1 class. And you take out your notes and you review them. And it's going to be, say, Introduction to Philosophy. Okay. For the past 10 years, you've had all these ideas as to how to be a good teacher. But these ideas were never tested. They lived up there with wings next to the gods up there. But now that you have to be in the classroom, the story is a little different. And so you have all these ideas and assumptions as to how you're going to be. And then you open your mouth. And one by one you see students packing their stuff and leaving. Is that what you mean? There is a passage in the Quran beginning that it's, I suppose, a prayer that all human beings pray. They turn to the gods and say, please don't test us, because we will fail. You know, the idea of parenthood, as an idea, it's beautiful. As parents with children, in a society such as this, it doesn't matter what ideas you have. The culture will kill those ideas, and you realize that most of the ideas you had are no longer applicable. Love is wonderful. Under the same roof, a long-term relationship. Love has no place in long-term relationships. It's all politics. Sometimes all of us, have experience. You wake up early morning and you say you want to write. You've been restless throughout the night, and you're inspired to wake up early and write. And your companion is, resting and snoring. You get out of bed, you go to your study, turn on the laptop, and you sit there and nothing comes. I think it's always been the case, Ginning, that ideas are immaculate. They're beautiful, they're clean, they're pure. They have wings. The allegory of the cave, it's a beautiful story. It's about a man who sleeps. It's about a man who becomes curious. It's about someone who begins to ask a lot of questions. He loses a lot of friends. He loses his wife or husband. He loses his kids or her kids. He gets sad and depressed. And he continues the journey. And eventually he finds what he was looking for. He's excited. He goes back to share his findings with his friends and his family and community, but no one likes to hear what he has to say. As stories go, it's a great story. But if you were that person, you go home and look at your companion and you have no idea why he or she is there and why you're there. You begin to question marriage and children and a house and a mortgage and the meaning to your life, and you realize it was a good story, but now that the story has come down and you actually have to live it, it's quite painful. It's not fun at all. We love good stories, Ginning. Our tragedy is once in a while, those stories actually come true for us in the sense that we become the character in the story, that we have to go through the journey. And for the first time, we understand with our body and with our emotions how this journey feels. You're not just sitting back and watching The Matrix. You're not just sitting back and watching the movie V for Vendetta. You're not just sitting back and watching The English Patient. You're living it. And you realize that, while sitting and reading a book, it's such a great feeling that yes, she left her husband for the person she loves. But then you find yourself in a similar situation. What do I tell my husband? What do I tell my in-laws? What do I tell my parents? What do I tell God, my friends? How do I lift my head? What do I do with shame? What do I do with all this stuff? And then you realize the book didn't have most of the important components that take place. You find yourself on the Bay Bridge, you're about to jump. That wasn't in the book. You're depressed. That wasn't in the book. You're lonely. That wasn't in the book. And I think the difference between practical teachers and theoretical teachers is just that. Some teachers just walk in the classroom and inspire you. And some teachers say, no, inspiration is just the very beginning. It's nothing. It's like a spark, Theory and application are two very, very, very different worlds. I can't tell you, Ginning, over the years how many students have shown interest, but the moment the ideas get a little too close and a little too personal, and when they have to walk home from the classroom or the office or from the house, they realize that there's just too much for them, you know, and their life is falling apart. You know, it's kind of like when the Iraq War took place, most of the senators and Congress people, they found a way to keep their own kids in the States. They wanted them out of harm's way. The idea of justice is good. The idea of fighting for your country is good. But let other people do it. You know, my kids, they have more value than other kids, other parents. That's always been the story. One of the reasons why I personally dislike bumper stickers, you know, the unexamined life is not worth living, or love, is that they're really nice to listen to. These are nice stories. But the moment you train someone, you know, after each training they kind of walk away all bloodied, you know. You have to be very, very thick-skinned to kind of be able to bring theories down from the sky and apply them to real life and then see how they pan out. Sometimes you go to division meetings. Sometimes you get chancellors, you know, coming to the campus and they talk about education, you know. And it surprises me, women who are chancellors or deans, women who are married, women who are mothers. It's like they forget the difficulty of being a mother, raising a kid, and just come to these meetings so casually talk about, you know, how to teach students, you know. Since we were talking about theory and application, and we were talking about Karl Marx, you know, one of the things that happened to Karl Marx was that initially he was in love with Hegel, but there came a point he just found Hegel to be ridiculous. It's all thoughts, it's all ideas. You know, you see like all these people losing their jobs in the government. And then you have politicians coming on TV saying all these ridiculous things. You know, you lose your job, you lose your paycheck, you can't pay your mortgage, you lose your health care, your entire physical life turns upside down. As a politician, you really need to have an element of shame before opening your mouth and making this whole thing sound so casual. I mean, it's no joke, Ginning, for almost 100,000 people to have lost their job overnight. You know, I mean, you have a house. I mean, it's part of who and what you are. And to suddenly realize you don't have money to pay the mortgage, and you've already paid them like 500,000, and the bank is going to come and take the whole thing away, and you won't get a penny back. Where are you going to sleep? What's going to happen to your kids? You know. And this angered Marx. You know. So change can't happen in theory. It doesn't work that way. You know, Daughter of Fire is great. It's a good book. But you may be one of those tragic figures who may in fact run into a Bai Sahib. And you realize, well, you're not just reading a book anymore. This is your life. And this guy is playing with your life. You know. You know, there's a reason why he was expelled from all these countries. You know, Gurdjieff was really good. He wanted people with common sense. He wanted people with thick skin. He knew that change doesn't take place by sitting somewhere and talking about stuff. It doesn't do anything. You know. You know, if you want to know if someone loves you or not, you tell them to go to some place and grab a jug of wine or beer, carry it on their head, you know, around the 13th century, in a Muslim environment, you know. Because it's not a theory. If you want change, if you want transformation, you know, Shams is going to turn your life upside down. All these years, you know, you sit in the back of the classroom. Not you, I'm just talking in general. You know, you make all these judgments about these teachers being boring, being awful, being irrelevant, being old, being ridiculous. And then, you know, you create this Harry Potter narrative in your head that I'm going to be so different. And then you walk in there and you realize, man, this is no joke. You know, 40 students are looking at you. What are you going to do? What are you going to say? You know, and you realize, you know, for some people it's just a job and there is nothing wrong. For some people it's an extension of their soul and that's just the way things are. You may, at times, you know, sit in your study and pray for a Bai Sahib to come to your life because you're in love with Daughter of Fire. It's such a wonderful book. You know, and maybe Bai Sahib will walk into your life and you may come to realize you just like it in book form, you know. You know, it reminds me of Fyodor Dostoevsky's Brother Karamazov, where it's Easter, you know. And all these people are celebrating Jesus has come back. And Jesus all of a sudden appears to them and says, I have no idea what you guys are doing. If you guys are doing this for me, this is not my tradition. You know. Ideas are safe. The idea of having children is safe. The idea of being a parent is safe. The idea of being a teacher is safe. The idea of being in love is safe. But once they hit ground, You know, it's like a meteor. It's good in the movies, but when it hits, it's a different story. And the truth is, without being tested, you will never know your own value. And you will never really know the value of ideas. You know, what upsets me about the allegory of the cave is all the difficulties that have to be endured by the person who has to walk away from the cave and then go back in. Because if I want to go out of this cave, I need a GPS. I need Plato to write down everything. I need to know that if I do this, my wife will leave me. And I want to know how it feels when my wife leaves me. I want to know that when I take this journey, that my kids will feel abandoned by their father. And I want to know how that feels. I want to know how it tastes to be confused, to be fearful, to be uncertain. You know, I want to know what it means to suffer loss, to be depressed. You know. And I want to know why, after having discovered the sun or the truth, why I would want to go back to the cave. What is it that happens to me that all of a sudden I want to share? How do I become generous like that? Why do I become a sacrificial lamb? What is it about this particular understanding that transforms me? And what happens when I get rejected? After all the things I go through. You know, it's like you go home and you clean your house and you spend hours making wonderful food, and then your husband comes home, doesn't pay you attention, doesn't eat your food, takes a shower, gets in his car and goes to the gym. You say, what the hell? I've spent the past 2 weeks doing all the stuff and this guy just comes in and leaves. And you feel hurt. You feel invisible. You're enraged. But you don't get any of that in the allegory. You know? And you say, you know what? You wrote this allegory. You tempt me. I take that temptation seriously. And I begin to experience all these disastrous things. And I go back to the allegory as a GPS. And I don't find any of the stuff there. You know. So, you know, there is a reason why Gurdjieff had his people live with him. If you want to destroy someone's life, you have to be available to them all the time, because they can't do it on their own. It's not possible. But there are different kinds of teachers. Some teachers just work with ideas. Some people bring ideas down and bring them to life. There are some students who only like theory. There are some students who like the application. You know. But those who, and no one knows who enjoys what. You test people. You know, it really is a shot in the dark. It really is. I'm sorry, I don't know if that was your question. You know, I have this, I no longer, I'm in touch with this person, but he comes to class, sits, listens to the ideas, inspired by them, majors in philosophy or religious studies. Moves to a different country. And every person who walks into his life just gets destroyed. Because he doesn't know how to make these ideas practical. They're poison. The ideas give him a sense of power, makes him look attractive. And people do become attracted to this person. And they assume that, you know, there is understanding there. Time passes. It's just hollow. Just hollow. You know. You know, because I know there will be a time where you will grow tired of this place. You know. I want to make sure you have a life outside of here. That you have a companion, that you have a job, that you have a house. So when this place bores you, when I'm dead, there's a place you can fall back to, you know. So you don't become like some of our friends with no job, no money, no life. Can't see anything. Stacy?
Thank you.
Love. That's the question you asked now. I'll just tell you a tiny little thing about love. You heard of Hallaj. Hallaj was a Sufi mystic who had said, Ana al-Haq, like Jesus, I am the truth, you know. And because it's a blasphemous thing to say, they killed him. So one day they asked him, can you tell us about love? And he says to them, wait to see how my today will end. Wait to see how my tomorrow is. And wait to see how my day after tomorrow will be. And they're all puzzled. Because he had a lot of devoted students and, you know, teachers. They wait and wait, and they realize that day one he was hanged. Day two he was burnt. Day three his ashes were scattered into the wind. He says that's what love is. That there is nothing in life that you will ever value. Life no longer becomes interesting or important or valuable to you. That's what love does. You know, it's like when you have a pain, like the pain I had a couple days ago. I didn't care about the bed or this house. Pain isolates you from everything. You're all alone. You have no mom, you have no dad, and you have some maturity to you. You're not going to pick up the phone and say, I need help. You say, you know what? No one's going to do anything for me. No one can do anything for me. This is what I have to do. I'm in pain. I either scream or just hold it in. You know? So love creates its own pain, its own longing, its own yearning. It takes everything away from you. And then you get burnt. You turn into dust. It's like you belong to nothing, you belong to no one. And wherever life goes, it just takes you with it and you don't really care because you have no attachment to anything. No one looks at you, no one cares for you, no one values you. That's what love does. The only thing that you have to be careful is the object of love. You know, just make sure you don't fall in love with something that's cheap and ridiculous and stupid, because then you'll be left bitter and angry and resentful, and you will seek justice and vengeance and all those things. If on the other hand you fall in love like Plato, you know, you'll write, you'll find a school, you'll teach, you'll have students. You'll be self-sufficient. But there is a window, you know. And it's good that it's a window because, you know, at a certain age, your body needs to rest. At a certain age, your mind needs to rest. You know, you don't want this fire to be burning inside you forever. You want it to die down. You want it to calm down. You want to just, you know, do some gardening. You want to go around the lake and walk a little. You want to enjoy the weather. You have paid your dues. You know, you have every right to kind of just sit back and rest. But while young and you have the energy and the stamina, you can burn from within, you know, and you can turn into ash. But always, you know, protect this other life of yours that needs to survive without love. You know, you can be like Karl Marx, you know, filled with passion, but you can also be devoted to your wife Jenny, and you could also be devoted to your daughter Jenny. That when they both die, you just die too after a couple of months. And despite your passion, you're also very grounded. And you need to be grounded. It's important. See, first you need to be in love, and then slowly learn how to be grounded. If you're grounded, very attached, it's going to take a lot of difficulties to fall in love because there is so much to give up. It happens, but it's just difficult, you know. You know, be in love with Gurdjieff, but make sure that you have a 9-to-5 job. Because there's a part of you that's mature enough to know that you can't understand Gurdjieff completely. That Gurdjieff is old enough to die eventually. That you have to figure things out on your own. And you can't figure anything out on your own with an empty stomach and no roof over your head. And no companion who can once in a while sit and watch a movie with you.